"Excuse me, ma'am, but I'm going to need you to step away from the cart." The officer's voice was sharp, cutting through the low hum of the grocery store like a blade. Eyes turned. Whispers started. The woman froze, her hand gripping the handle of the cart filled with simple groceries, bread, eggs, milk, and canned vegetables. Nothing about her looked out of place, but the officers saw something different. They always did. "I didn't do anything," she said, her voice steady but laced with tension. "Ma'am, I said step away from the cart." The second officer's voice was louder now, drawing more attention. People stopped in the aisles. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering something in her ear before turning her back. No one stepped in. The first officer grabbed her wrist. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We've had reports about suspicious behavior in this area. Now, are you going to cooperate, or do we have to take this further?" "Suspicious?" Her voice cracked as she tried to steady herself. "I came here to buy groceries." "Suspicious how?" "Because I'm shopping." The officer didn't answer. Instead, he tightened his grip and yanked her away from the cart. The items inside wobbled, a carton of eggs falling to the floor and cracking, spilling yolk across the polished tiles. A sharp laugh erupted from one of the officers. "Ma'am, we can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. You choose," the second officer said, stepping closer. Her breath hitched as the crowd circled around her. A phone was out, recording, but no one spoke up. She looked down at her worn sneakers and the faded logo on her sweatshirt, suddenly conscious of every crease, every sign of wear and tear. "I'm a veteran," she said, her voice low but firm. "I served this country. I have rights." "A veteran?" The first officer sneered. "You don't look like any veteran I've ever seen. Where's your badge? Where's your proof? Or is that just another story to get out of this?" The woman's hands trembled, not out of fear, but rage. "I don't have to prove anything to you." But proof didn't matter. Within seconds, her arms were behind her back, the cold steel of handcuffs biting into her wrists as she was pushed against the checkout counter. Her groceries spilled to the floor, bread crushed under boots, milk leaking out in a puddle around her feet. Tears burned her eyes, but she wouldn't let them fall. "Not here. Not in front of them." "Stop resisting," one of the officers barked, though she hadn't moved an inch. "I'm not resisting," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing murmurs from the onlookers. "Take her outside." They dragged her through the automatic doors, out into the bright daylight. The pavement was hot under her knees as they forced her down, pressing her face against the ground. Cameras flashed, photos and videos being taken, but no one intervened. "Search her bag," one officer said. "There's nothing in it," another replied. "So plant something. She fits the type." Those words sliced through the air, louder than anything else that had been said. The woman turned her head, locking eyes with the officer who had spoken. She saw it then, the smugness, the certainty that they could get away with this. She'd fought battles before. She'd faced danger head-on and walked through fire. But this humiliation, cut deeper than any wound she'd ever endured. When they finally let her up, bruised and broken, something inside her shifted. The cameras caught her face, and for the first time, she let the tears fall, not out of defeat, but out of determination. Because what the officers didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that the woman they just dragged through the dirt wasn't just any veteran. She was decorated, honored, and respected. And she had connections. What happened next left the entire city in shock. Would justice finally prevail? Or would the system protect the men who tore her dignity apart? One thing was certain, no one saw what was coming. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. This channel is a safe space where stories are told to inspire, challenge, and empower. To every Black viewer watching this video, you are valued, respected, and your voice matters. Today's story highlights injustice but also resilience, strength, and triumph. We hope it resonates with you and reminds you of the power that lies in courage and perseverance. If you enjoy thought-provoking and emotional stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support our work. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. The sun hung low in the afternoon sky, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of the small neighborhood grocery store parking lot. It wasn't much of a store, just a modest building with faded paint and flickering lights above the entrance. Inside, the aisles were narrow, shelves slightly disorganized, but it served its purpose for the locals. It was a place where people shopped after work, picking up essentials and chatting briefly before heading home. For Gloria Harris, it was just another stop on a list of errands, a simple, forgettable moment in what should have been an uneventful day. Gloria wasn't the kind of woman who sought attention. At 56, she carried herself with quiet confidence, the kind that came from surviving more battles than most could imagine. Her hair, streaked with gray, was pulled back into a neat bun, and her clothes, comfortable jeans and a sweatshirt that had seen better days, reflected someone who didn't feel the need to impress anyone. Her dark skin was smooth despite the years, but her eyes told the real story. They were sharp, always scanning, always observing, like someone who had been trained to expect the unexpected. She pushed her cart down the aisle, scanning the shelves for canned beans. Her list was short, just a few basics, but each item represented careful planning. Gloria had never been one to waste money. She'd learned early on how to make things stretch, first growing up poor in Alabama and later as a single mother raising her son, Marcus, after her husband passed away. Life had never been easy, but she'd always found a way. Gloria's past was woven with discipline and sacrifice. She had enlisted in the military at 19, looking for a way out of her small town and the dead-end jobs that seemed to trap everyone around her. The military gave her structure, purpose, and the means to provide for her family. She served with honor, completing tours overseas, facing danger head-on, and earning the respect of those around her. But none of that mattered in this moment. Here, in this store, she was just another black woman pushing a cart. A voice cut through the air, sharp and cold. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the cart." Gloria looked up, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the uniformed officer standing a few feet away. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a clean-shaven face that seemed carved out of stone. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Behind him stood another officer, younger but no less intimidating, his hand resting lightly on his belt. Gloria's first instinct was to comply. Years of following orders had conditioned her to react quickly, but something about their stance made her pause. "What's this about?" Her voice was calm, steady, but the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her nerves. The older officer took a step closer. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. You match the description." "Suspicious?" Gloria's eyebrows knit together. "I'm buying groceries." "How is that suspicious?" The younger officer shifted, clearly uncomfortable, but the older one didn't flinch. "Ma'am, I'm asking you to step away from the cart. We can clear this up quickly if you just cooperate." Years of training told her not to argue, but years of living told her that cooperating didn't always guarantee safety. She slowly raised her hands, stepping back just as the older officer reached for her cart. He began rifling through the items, pushing aside the bread, the eggs, the cans. "There's nothing here," the younger officer muttered, his voice low. "Check her bag," the older one snapped. Gloria's stomach dropped. She knew what was coming. She'd seen it before, on the news, in viral videos. She'd spent her life preparing for war zones, but nothing prepared her for the feeling of being treated like a criminal in her own neighborhood. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice firm. "You're making a mistake." "Let us decide that," the older officer barked. She reached for her purse instinctively, and that's when it happened. Don't move. The older officer lunged, grabbing her arm and twisting it behind her back. Wait. I'm not resisting. Gloria cried out, pain shooting through her shoulder. The younger officer hesitated, but the older one tightened his grip. Stay down. The sound of eggs breaking against the floor mixed with the murmur of voices around them. People watched but did nothing. Phones were out, recording, but no one stepped in. Gloria's face burned, not just from the pain, but from the humiliation. She was on her knees now, her wrists bound by cold metal cuffs. Search her bag, the older officer ordered. The younger one hesitated. There's nothing in it. Check again. The words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating Gloria as she knelt there, her groceries scattered like evidence of a crime that didn't exist. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but she knew better. Fighting back could mean worse. Her eyes locked onto the younger officers for a brief moment, and for the first time, she saw doubt. But doubt didn't stop him from following orders. Minutes later, Gloria was being dragged outside, her feet scraping against the pavement. The heat burned through her jeans, but she barely noticed. Her mind was racing, replaying the moment over and over. She didn't deserve this. She knew that much. But what shook her wasn't the injustice itself, it was the look on the older officer's face. He didn't see her as a person. To him, she was nothing more than a problem to be dealt with, a box to check. Gloria had faced enemies before. She'd stood her ground in combat zones, stared down danger without blinking. But this was different. This wasn't war. This was home. And in that moment, as the cameras captured her humiliation, she made a decision. They didn't know who she was. Not yet. But they would. What would happen when the truth came out? What would happen when the world learned that the woman they had dragged through the dirt wasn't just another name or another statistic? Gloria wasn't done fighting. She was just getting started. The fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed faintly, casting a dull, sterile glow over the cramped room. Gloria sat in the corner, her hands still aching from the tightness of the cuffs. Her wrists bore red marks, but she refused to rub them. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her discomfort. The room smelled faintly of coffee and stale cigarettes, but Gloria barely noticed. Her focus was on the two officers standing near the desk, whispering and occasionally glancing in her direction. Officer Bradley, the older one who had shoved her to the ground, leaned against the desk with a smirk on his face. His partner, Officer Reed, stood stiffly beside him, fidgeting with a pen and avoiding eye contact. Gloria could feel the tension between them, but she didn't care about their dynamic. She cared about getting out of this room with her dignity intact. Bradley finally turned toward her, his smirk widening. "You've got a bit of an attitude for someone in your position," he said, crossing his arms. Gloria didn't flinch. "And you've got a lot of nerve for someone who just assaulted an innocent woman." Bradley's smile faded. "Watch it. You're lucky we're not pressing charges. Resisting arrest, obstruction, disorderly conduct, I could make sure you spend the night in a cell." Reed cleared his throat. "Bradley, maybe we should what? Let her walk out of here like nothing happened. She's got a mouth on her, and I don't like it." Gloria's voice was calm, but sharp. "You don't have to like it. You just have to follow the law." Bradley stepped closer, his jaw tightening. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but you're not scaring anybody in here." Gloria stared at him, unblinking. "Not yet." The room went quiet. Reed shifted nervously, looking between Bradley and Gloria. "Look, maybe we should just let her make a statement and move on," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Bradley ignored him. "You think you're tough? Think you can talk your way out of this? You're nobody. Just another loudmouth trying to play victim." Gloria leaned forward slightly. "And you're just another bully hiding behind a badge." But I'll tell you this, you picked the wrong woman. Bradley's eyes narrowed. Is that a threat? Gloria tilted her head. No. It's a promise. Before Bradley could respond, the door to the room opened, and a tall man in a suit stepped inside. He carried himself with authority, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Gloria. Ms. Harris, you're free to go, he said, holding up a folder. Your lawyer's waiting outside. Gloria stood slowly, her movements deliberate. Bradley's face turned red, but he didn't say a word. Reed looked visibly relieved, stepping back as Gloria walked past them. She paused at the door, turning to face Bradley one last time. This isn't over, she said quietly. Outside the station, Marcus was waiting. His tall frame was rigid with anger, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Mom, are you okay? He asked, his voice low but shaking. I'm fine, Gloria said, though her voice betrayed the exhaustion settling into her bones. Marcus shook his head. No, you're not. They had no right to do this. We need to file a complaint, take this to the media, do something. Gloria placed a hand on his arm. We will. But not yet. He looked at her, confused. What do you mean, not yet? They need to pay for this. They will, Gloria said, her voice steady again. But we're going to do it the right way. Over the next few days, Gloria began gathering information. She reached out to old contacts, people she hadn't spoken to in years but knew would still pick up the phone. Former commanders, attorneys, even an investigative journalist she'd once helped overseas. Slowly, a plan started to form. Marcus wasn't as patient. He spent hours scrolling through social media, furious at the comments on the video that had surfaced of the incident. Some people supported Gloria, but others, far too many, sided with the officers, calling her combative and disrespectful. Marcus wanted to fight back, to call them out, but Gloria stopped him. Let them talk, she said. We're not here to convince strangers. We're here to make sure this never happens again. In the meantime, Bradley and Reed went about their lives as if nothing had happened. Bradley, in particular, seemed emboldened by the lack of consequences. He bragged to his co-workers about putting Gloria in her place, twisting the story to make it seem like she'd been aggressive and uncooperative. Reed, however, couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his chest since that day. He avoided Gloria's name in conversations, but it haunted him. He began double-checking reports, rereading statements, and replaying the incident in his mind. He knew they'd crossed a line, but he also knew speaking up could cost him his job. The tension continued to build. Gloria worked quietly, methodically, while Marcus pushed harder, demanding justice. Reed wrestled with his guilt, and Bradley grew more arrogant, blind to the storm that was about to hit. And then, one morning, everything changed. Bradley arrived at the station to find his name plastered across headlines. Video footage had surfaced, not just of Gloria's arrest, but of several other incidents involving Bradley using excessive force. Complaints that had been buried were now out in the open. People were talking, and they weren't backing down. Reed's phone buzzed with messages, each one pulling him deeper into panic. Bradley, however, dismissed it all as noise. They'll get bored, he said. They always do. But Gloria wasn't bored. She was focused. And as the pieces of her plan began falling into place, it became clear that this wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger. Bradley thought he had one. He thought Gloria was just another face in a crowd, someone he could intimidate and forget. But what he didn't realize was that Gloria Harris wasn't finished. She was just getting started. The police station was alive with restless energy. Phones rang in the background, chairs scraped against the tiled floor, and murmurs filled the hallways. Officer Bradley marched through the noise, his boots striking the ground with heavy, deliberate steps. Each stride echoed with irritation and defiance. He didn't belong in this situation, not here, not now. This was supposed to be just another day, another shift where he called the shots. Instead, he'd been summoned, yanked out of his routine, and dragged into what felt like a trap. He could feel the stares, the sudden drop in chatter when he passed. Colleagues who once laughed at his jokes and backed him up in tense situations now avoided his gaze. It was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of shift in behavior that signaled trouble. Behind him, Officer Reed followed closely, his face pale and tight with tension. The younger officer hadn't said a word since they left their desks, and Bradley didn't need to ask why. Reed had been acting strange for days, skittish, jumpy, avoiding conversations that veered anywhere near the incident. Bradley stopped at the captain's office and knocked hard before pushing the door open without waiting for a response. He hated being kept in the dark, and the fact that Gloria Harris was in the room only made his blood boil. She stood near the window, her sharp blazer and pressed slacks a stark contrast to the casual sweatshirt and jeans she'd been wearing the last time they met. Her posture was unshakable, her chin high, and her eyes, those eyes, were locked on him the moment he entered. Beside her stood a man in a dark suit, sleek and polished, flipping through a thick folder of documents. Captain Monroe sat behind the desk, her expression unreadable, but Bradley could tell from the tension in her shoulders that this wasn't just a routine meeting. Bradley's voice was sharp. "What the hell is this?" Monroe didn't blink. "Sit down, Bradley." Bradley hesitated but eventually dropped into the chair, leaning back and folding his arms. Reed slid into the seat next to him, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Bradley's focus stayed on Gloria. "Couldn't just move on, could you?" Gloria's voice was steady, deliberate. "Move on? You think this ends because you walked away without consequences?" Bradley smirked. "I didn't do anything wrong." Her lawyer interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Nothing wrong. Let's talk about what's in this file." He dropped it on the desk and flipped it open, revealing photographs, reports, and signed statements. Excessive force. Racial profiling. Intimidation. Fabricated evidence. Should I keep going? Bradley leaned forward, his tone low and dangerous. "You think you can pin this on me? This is a witch hunt. She's twisting things, blowing this out of proportion." Gloria stepped closer to the table. "You humiliated me. You threw me to the ground, handcuffed me, and treated me like garbage. And for what? Because I didn't fit the profile of someone who should be shopping for groceries? Because I was too black to be innocent in your eyes?" Bradley's jaw tightened. "I followed protocol." Gloria's eyes never wavered. "No. You abused your power, and it stops today." Monroe cleared her throat. "We've reviewed the footage, Bradley. We've read the reports. And we've received additional complaints about your conduct in the past. We're not just talking about one incident, we're talking about a pattern." Bradley's face flushed red. "This is ridiculous. You're going to let her drag my name through the mud? I've been here for years, and this is the thanks I get?" Gloria's voice cut through his rant. "Years of what? Years of pushing people like me around because you knew you could get away with it. Not anymore." Reed shifted beside him, his voice hesitant. "She's right, Bradley." Bradley's head snapped toward him. "What?" Reed swallowed hard. "We crossed a line. You crossed a line. And you know it." Bradley glared. "Don't you dare." Monroe's voice rang out, sharp and final. "Enough. Bradley, you're suspended effective immediately. We'll be conducting a full investigation into your actions. Until further notice, turn in your badge and gun." Bradley's chair scraped against the floor as he shot to his feet. "You can't do this." The lawyer stepped forward, his tone cold. "We already did." Bradley's hands balled into fists at his sides. This is a setup. She planned this. Gloria didn't back down. I didn't have to. You did this to yourself. Bradley turned to Monroe. You're really going to let this happen? Monroe stared at him, unflinching. You brought this on yourself. Now get out of my office. For a moment, it looked like Bradley might argue again, but then his shoulders dropped, and he turned sharply, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed felt heavier than any word spoken. Reed looked down, guilt etched across his face. Monroe exhaled deeply and looked at Gloria. This isn't over. There's going to be backlash, but we're committed to making this right. Gloria nodded. That's all I ask. Outside the station, Marcus was waiting, pacing near the car. His phone buzzed constantly, the news spreading faster than either of them expected. When Gloria stepped out, he rushed to her side. Mom, you did it. It's everywhere. Gloria gave him a small smile. Good. Let them talk. Marcus grinned, but there was still fire in his eyes. What happens next? Gloria looked back at the station, her expression calm but resolute. Next, we make sure this never happens again. As they drove away, Gloria's phone buzzed with messages, reporters, advocates, and supporters reaching out. But her focus stayed sharp. Bradley might have been the first, but he wouldn't be the last. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. And she wasn't done fighting yet. She had spent her life standing her ground. This time, it wasn't just for herself. It was for everyone who had been silenced. And she was ready for whatever came next. The dim light from the overhead fixtures cast long shadows across the interrogation room where Officer Bradley now sat, his hands clasped tightly on the table. His eyes flickered toward the door every few seconds, but it remained shut. Sweat beaded at his temple, and he shifted uncomfortably in the stiff chair. Across from him, Captain Monroe leaned back, her arms crossed, her gaze heavy and unrelenting. Next to her, Gloria Harris sat, her expression calm but sharp, her presence undeniable. The room felt smaller than it was, the silence pressing in like a weight neither of them could shake. Bradley finally broke it, his voice cracking slightly. You can't just let her sit here like she owns the place. She's not one of us. Gloria's eyes didn't move from him. One of you. Her voice was steady but edged with steel. I never wanted to be one of you. I wanted to believe the system could work, that the badge could mean something. But you proved me wrong. Bradley leaned forward, his voice rising. You don't know what it's like to wear this uniform, to be out there every day wondering if someone's going to take a shot at you. You don't get it. Gloria didn't flinch. You think I don't get it? I spent years overseas, in places you can't even pronounce, risking my life for this country. I've faced enemies with guns pointed at my head and bombs under my feet, but nothing prepared me for what I faced in that grocery store. Nothing prepared me for the humiliation of being treated like a threat in my own neighborhood. Bradley shook his head, his voice tight. That's not what this is about. You were acting suspicious. We had a call. We followed protocol. Gloria's voice rose slightly, the calm slipping for just a moment. Protocol. You didn't even ask questions. You saw my skin, and that was enough. Enough to throw me to the ground. Enough to put cuffs on me. Enough to strip away every ounce of dignity I had left. Monroe cut in, her voice sharp. Enough. She turned to Bradley, her tone hard. I've read the reports. I've seen the footage. Don't sit here and insult my intelligence by pretending this was protocol. You didn't see a threat, you saw an opportunity. And you took it. Bradley's chair scraped against the floor as he stood suddenly, his voice shaking. I was doing my job. Gloria stood too, her voice cutting through the tension. No, you weren't. Your job is to protect and serve. Instead, you humiliated and abused someone who didn't deserve it. Someone who's risked more for this country than you ever will. Bradley's fists clenched at his sides, but Monroe's voice stopped him cold. Sit down. For the first time, Bradley hesitated. His eyes darted to Reed, who had slipped into the room quietly and now stood by the door, his expression conflicted but firm. Bradley sank back into his chair, his shoulders hunched. Reed finally spoke, his voice low but steady. Bradley, it's over. You need to stop. Bradley shot him a look. You're taking her side. Reed's voice hardened. I'm taking the truth's side. And the truth is, I should have stopped you. I should have spoken up right then and there. But I didn't, and I regret it. I can't take that moment back, but I won't let it define me either. Not anymore. Bradley's eyes darted back to Monroe, desperate now. This is insane. You're going to let her tear this department apart? You're going to let her ruin my career? Monroe leaned forward, her voice low and controlled. You ruined your career. You did this. And now you're going to face the consequences. Gloria stepped closer to the table, her voice softer but no less firm. You think this is about ruining you? This isn't about you, Bradley. This is about accountability. It's about justice. It's about making sure the next black woman who walks into a store doesn't have to wonder if she'll make it out without being humiliated, or worse. Bradley shook his head, his voice cracking. You don't understand. People like me, we get blamed for everything. We're just trying to do our jobs, and now I'm the bad guy. Gloria's voice carried the weight of years of frustration and pain. You're the bad guy because you chose to be. You had a choice, Bradley, and you made the wrong one. I've spent my whole life making choices that protected people like you, choices that kept this country safe. And what did I get in return? You in my face, calling me a liar, treating me like I didn't matter. But I do matter. And so does every person who's ever been treated the way I was treated. The room went silent again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with the truth, with words that couldn't be taken back. Monroe finally stood, closing the folder on the table. This department will move forward, but not with you in it, she said, looking directly at Bradley. Turn in your badge and weapon. Effective immediately. Bradley opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he looked small, like the weight of his actions had finally sunk in. He stood slowly, his movements mechanical, and walked toward the door. As he passed Gloria, he stopped, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Gloria looked at him, her voice steady. But it did. Bradley walked out without another word, the door clicking shut behind him. Reed turned to Gloria, his voice thick. I'm sorry. I should have done more. Gloria studied him for a moment before speaking. You still can. Don't let this end here. Be better than him. Reed nodded, his eyes reflecting the weight of her words. Monroe stepped forward, extending her hand to Gloria. You're the reason this is happening. You didn't back down, and I respect that. We need more people like you holding us accountable. Gloria shook her hand, her voice calm but resolute. Accountability is just the beginning. The real work starts now. As Gloria stepped out of the station into the fading sunlight, Marcus was waiting, his face filled with pride and relief. She didn't smile, but there was a quiet strength in her expression as she looked at him and then out at the horizon. This fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But Gloria Harris had faced battles before, and she wasn't afraid of what came next. The air outside the station felt heavier than Gloria expected. The setting sun cast long shadows on the pavement, but even as the day wound down, her mind was racing. Marcus walked beside her, his silence speaking louder than words. She could feel the tension rolling off him, the same tension that had simmered since the incident. He had wanted fire, immediate consequences, and explosive justice. What he saw instead was a slow, deliberate process, and she knew it hadn't satisfied him yet. Marcus finally broke the silence, his voice low but sharp. That's it. He just walks out. He doesn't go to jail, doesn't lose everything. After what he did. Gloria stopped, turning to face him. Her eyes were steady, but her voice softened. This isn't over, Marcus. Bradley's gone, but the fight doesn't stop with him. It's bigger than one man, it's about all the others like him. It's about the system that let him get away with it for so long. Marcus shook his head, his frustration clear. But he gets to walk away today like nothing happened. What about you? What about everything you went through? Gloria exhaled slowly, grounding herself before answering. I didn't do this to tear him down. I did it to make sure no one else has to go through what I did. If that takes time, then so be it. Change doesn't happen overnight. Marcus ran a hand over his head, pacing in front of her. I don't know how you stay so calm. I want him to feel what you felt. I want him to suffer. Gloria stepped closer, her voice firm but not unkind. You think I don't? You think I didn't lie awake at night picturing 100 ways to make him pay? But that's not who I am, and it's not who you are. Don't let him drag you down to his level. Marcus stopped, staring at her. His chest heaved as he tried to find words, but none came. Gloria reached out, resting a hand on his shoulder. Justice doesn't always look like revenge, Marcus. Sometimes it looks like accountability. Sometimes it looks like forcing people to see the truth, even when they don't want to. He nodded reluctantly, though the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed completely. And what if the truth isn't enough? Gloria's voice was steady. Then we make sure it is. The days that followed were a blur of interviews, press conferences, and meetings. Gloria's story spread faster than she could have imagined. News anchors dissected every detail, experts debated the case, and social media exploded with reactions. Videos of the incident were played and replayed, sparking outrage and support in equal measure. Protesters gathered outside the station, demanding reforms and accountability, while others dismissed her as just another person playing the victim card. Marcus stayed glued to his phone, tracking every post, every headline, but Gloria focused on the work. She met with community leaders, spoke at events, and pushed for policy changes. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for something bigger. Still, the backlash was unavoidable. Anonymous threats filled her inbox. Old acquaintances surfaced with opinions she hadn't asked for. And through it all, Gloria felt the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She'd won a battle, but the war was far from over. Late one evening, Gloria sat alone in her living room, the glow of the television casting shadows across the walls. Marcus had gone out to clear his head, leaving her with her thoughts. She stared at the folder on the coffee table, the one her lawyer had given her, filled with evidence and statements. It was supposed to make her feel powerful, like she had control, but instead, it felt heavy, almost suffocating. A knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. She hesitated, then stood and opened it to find Officer Reed standing there, his face pale and drawn. Gloria didn't move, her voice sharp. What do you want? Reed shifted nervously, his hands tucked into his pockets. I need to talk to you. She stepped aside reluctantly, closing the door behind him as he entered. He stood awkwardly, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for impact. I shouldn't be here, he said finally. I know that. But I couldn't let this go without saying something. Gloria crossed her arms, waiting. Then say it. Reed swallowed hard, his voice trembling. I'm sorry. For all of it. For standing there and letting it happen. For not speaking up sooner. I should have stopped him. I should have been better. Gloria's eyes didn't leave his. Why now? Why not then? Reed looked down, shame written across his face. Because I was scared. Scared of losing my job, scared of going against him, scared of what people would think. But none of that justifies what I did, or what I didn't do. Gloria's voice was sharp. You're right. It doesn't. Reed flinched but nodded. I can't change what happened. But I can help fix what's broken. If you'll let me. Gloria studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. And what exactly do you think you can fix? Reed straightened slightly, his voice steadier. I'm willing to testify. About everything. Not just what happened to you, but all the other times I saw him cross the line. I've got reports, records, things that were buried. It won't undo what he did to you, but it'll make sure he never does it to anyone else. Gloria's expression softened, but only slightly. Why should I trust you? Reed's voice cracked. Because I can't keep living with this. And because I owe it to you, to every person I failed. Silence filled the room again, but this time it wasn't hostile. Gloria finally nodded. You want to help? Then start talking. Reed exhaled, relief washing over him. He pulled a folder from his jacket and set it on the table, his hands trembling. Gloria sat down, opening it, her eyes scanning the pages. It was worse than she expected. Case after case, complaints, witness statements, internal reviews that had been buried. She looked up at him, her voice steady but heavy. This is just the beginning, isn't it? Reed nodded. It is. But it's a start. Gloria closed the folder, her jaw set. Then let's finish it. As Reed left, Marcus returned, his eyes narrowing when he saw Gloria at the table with the evidence spread out in front of her. What's all this? Gloria looked up, her voice calm but resolute. It's the truth. And we're going to make sure the world sees it. Marcus's expression hardened, but this time it wasn't anger, it was determination. I'm in. And just like that, the fight wasn't hers alone anymore. It was bigger than her, bigger than Bradley, bigger than any one person. It was a movement. And it was only just beginning. The night felt heavier than usual as Gloria sat in the dimly lit room, papers scattered across the table in front of her. Her hands rested flat on the surface, her fingers grazing the edges of documents that felt too heavy to lift. Reed's folder sat open, exposing names and dates, records of violations swept under the rug, complaints dismissed without investigation, and patterns of abuse that stretched back years. The weight of it pressed against her chest, but she didn't look away. She couldn't. Marcus paced behind her, his footsteps quick and restless. His energy filled the space, crackling like static electricity. He kept glancing at the papers as if they might leap off the table and form accusations out loud. His frustration was palpable, but Gloria remained still, absorbing every word on the page, every detail that confirmed what she had always suspected. Marcus finally stopped, his voice sharp. How is this even possible? How did any of them, get away with this for so long? There's enough here to put half that department in cuffs. And no one did anything. Gloria didn't look up. Her voice was steady but low. Because they counted on no one looking. They counted on fear, silence, and people being too tired to fight. Marcus leaned over the table, his hands gripping the edge tightly. Not anymore. We have proof now. We can take this to the press, the courts, we can tear them apart. Gloria finally raised her eyes to meet his, her expression calm but resolute. And then what? What happens after the headlines fade? After the protests end? Do you think one article is enough to fix this? This isn't just about Bradley. It's about the culture that let him thrive. It's about every single person who looked the other way. If we don't hit them at the root, it'll keep growing back. Marcus's voice softened, but the fire in his eyes didn't fade. So what do we do? Just keep waiting? Hoping someone else steps in? Gloria shook her head. No. We don't wait. We keep pushing. But we do it right, Marcus. We don't just tear this down. We build something better. Before Marcus could respond, there was a knock at the door. Gloria's shoulders tensed, and Marcus instinctively moved toward the window, peeking through the blinds. Gloria stood slowly, her eyes fixed on the door as another knock echoed through the small apartment. She opened it to find Reed standing there again, his face pale and drawn, his eyes darting nervously toward the hallway. He held another folder, this one thinner but no less significant. Gloria didn't move aside immediately, her voice guarded. What now? Reed's voice was tight, barely above a whisper. We need to talk. Can I come in? Marcus stepped forward, his voice sharp. What is he doing here again? Reed hesitated, his gaze flickering between them. I found something. And if what's in here gets out, it's not just Bradley who's going down, it's the whole chain of command. Gloria stepped back, letting him in as Marcus crossed his arms, clearly unwilling to trust him. Reed set the folder down on the table, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. I went back through old files, things I didn't think mattered before but couldn't stop thinking about after what happened to you. It's worse than I thought. Complaints that were marked as resolved without investigation. Reports rewritten to cover up excessive force. And not just Bradley, Monroe knew. She signed off on half of these. Marcus's voice erupted, cutting through the tension. The captain? Are you serious? She stood there and acted like she wanted to fix things, and all this time she was covering it up. Reed nodded, his voice hollow. She's been burying cases for years. Keeping the department clean on paper while protecting guys like Bradley. And it's not just her. There are others, sergeants, lieutenants, people who should have stopped it but didn't. This isn't one bad apple. It's the whole tree. Gloria sat down again, her fingers brushing the edges of the new folder. Her voice was quiet, but it carried weight. If we go public with this, it's going to tear the department apart. Marcus didn't hesitate. Good. Let it burn. Reed looked panicked. You don't get it. This isn't just about the department. It's about the city. People need the police, and if this comes out, trust is going to shatter. You're talking riots, resignations, lawsuits that could bankrupt the system. You need to think about the fallout. Gloria's eyes snapped to him, sharp and focused. Fallout? You're worried about fallout now? Where was this concern when you were letting Bradley put his knee on people's necks and shove women like me into the dirt? Don't talk to me about fallout. Reed swallowed hard. I'm not trying to defend it. I'm just saying, once this starts, there's no stopping it. Are you ready for that? Gloria's voice didn't waver. I've been ready since the moment he put those cuffs on me. Marcus leaned in, his voice low but intense. So what's the plan? How do we make this stick? Because if they even think we're bluffing, they'll bury this before it ever sees the light of day. Gloria tapped the folder in front of her. We make it public, but not all at once. We leak parts of it, enough to start the fire, but not enough for them to see where it's coming from. We let them scramble, make mistakes, and then we hit them with everything. Reed's voice was shaky. You're talking about a war. Gloria met his eyes without hesitation. We're already in one. The room went silent, but the energy was electric. Reed looked like he wanted to protest, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of what he was signing up for. Marcus paced again, but this time his movements were less frantic, more purposeful. He stopped near the window, his voice softer now. And what if they come after you? After us? Gloria stood, her voice calm but filled with resolve. Let them try. Reed exhaled and pulled out a USB drive, sliding it across the table. Everything's on here. Copies of reports, emails, everything. It's enough to make this impossible to ignore. Gloria picked it up, holding it tightly. She looked at Marcus, then back at Reed. This is bigger than us now. Once we start this, there's no turning back. Marcus's voice came without hesitation. Good. I don't want to turn back. Reed didn't speak, but the look in his eyes said he knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Gloria let the weight of the moment settle before speaking again, her voice steady and certain. Then let's finish what we started. The dim light from the kitchen window cast a faint glow across the room as Gloria sat at the table, her hands resting on the folder in front of her. The weight of what they were about to do pressed down on her shoulders, but her focus remained sharp. Marcus sat across from her, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed tightly, his eyes fixed on the USB drive sitting beside the folder. Reed paced near the door, his movements restless, his footsteps soft but steady against the worn wooden floor. Marcus broke the silence first, his voice low but filled with tension. So when does this start? When do we put this out there? Gloria didn't look up. Her fingers traced the edges of the folder as though she was organizing her thoughts. Not yet. We need to be smart about this. Once we release it, we can't control where it goes. It has to be timed perfectly. Marcus leaned forward, frustration flickering in his voice. Timed perfectly. Mom, we've been sitting on this for days. Every hour we wait is another hour they could find a way to cover it up. We have everything we need. What are we waiting for? Gloria met his eyes, her voice calm but firm. We're waiting until we know it'll stick. If we drop this too soon, they'll spin it. They'll say it's lies, distort the evidence, discredit us. We need to be prepared for every move they might make. Marcus shook his head and pushed back from the table. And what if we're too late? What if they get to Reed or to us before we can do anything? You saw what they did to you. Do you really think they're just going to let this slide? Reed finally spoke, his voice tight and uneasy. He's right. They know something's coming. Monroe's been quiet, too quiet. And I saw some of the guys talking when I went back to clear out my locker. They're scared, but they're also ready to fight this. They're not going down without swinging first. Gloria stood slowly, her chair scraping lightly against the floor. She picked up the USB drive and held it up between her fingers, the small object suddenly feeling heavier than it should. Then we make sure they don't see it coming. We leak the first wave tonight, just enough to set them off balance. They'll scramble, and while they're busy trying to clean up one mess, we'll hit them with the rest. Marcus stepped closer, his voice tense but filled with determination. You sure about this? Once we start, there's no turning back. Gloria looked at him, her voice steady. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Reed exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. I'll handle the release. I still have contacts in the media, people I can trust to get it out there without tipping them off about who it's coming from. Marcus turned to him, his eyes sharp. And how do we know we can trust you? You were part of this, Reed. You stood by while it happened. What's stopping you from running back to them the second things get messy? Reed's jaw tightened, but his voice didn't waver. Because I can't take it back. I can't erase what I did, or what I didn't do, but I can damn sure make sure it doesn't happen again. You don't have to trust me, Marcus. But I'm here, and I'm not backing out. Marcus held his gaze for a long moment before finally nodding. Fine. But if you screw this up, it's not just your life on the line, it's ours too. Gloria stepped between them, her voice cutting through the tension. Enough. We don't have time for this. Reed's in, and that's the end of it. Focus on what's ahead. The room fell quiet again as Reed packed up the documents and the USB drive, his movements careful and deliberate. Marcus stayed near the table, his hands resting on the surface as if grounding himself. Gloria stood near the window, her eyes scanning the dark street outside. Reed finally spoke, his voice softer. "What happens if this doesn't work? What if they bury it before it spreads?" Gloria turned to him, her eyes sharp. "Then we keep pushing. We keep fighting. We don't stop until they can't ignore it anymore." Reed nodded, his face pale but determined. He picked up the folder and the drive, pausing at the door. "I'll make the drop tonight. You'll know when it hits." After he left, Marcus moved closer to Gloria, his voice quieter now. "Do you think he's scared?" Gloria looked at the closed door, her voice soft but sure. "We're all scared. But fear doesn't stop you when you know what's right." Hours passed, and Gloria found herself staring at the screen as the first news reports started rolling in. The leaked documents had spread faster than she expected, picked up by national outlets and amplified by social media. Videos and screenshots were shared, each new post adding fuel to the fire. Marcus sat beside her, scrolling through comments, his expression flickering between anger and satisfaction. "They're panicking. Look at this, they're already trying to deny it, but nobody's buying it." Gloria nodded, but her focus remained on the screen. "Good. Now we wait for the rest of it to drop." The next morning, her phone buzzed with messages, calls from reporters, texts from friends and strangers alike offering support. But mixed in were threats, anonymous warnings to back off, veiled messages reminding her of what was at stake. Marcus saw one of the messages and slammed his fist on the table. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. They're coming after you, Mom." Gloria didn't flinch. "Let them. I didn't come this far to stop now." Marcus's voice broke slightly. "But what if it gets worse? What if?" Gloria reached out, grabbing his hand firmly. "No what ifs. We keep moving forward. We're not done yet." Marcus took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "Okay. But I'm not letting you face this alone." Gloria's voice softened. "You never have." The sound of another notification interrupted them, and Marcus glanced at his phone. "It's Reed. He says it's done. Everything's out." Gloria's breath caught for just a moment, but she steadied herself quickly. "Then we brace ourselves. The storm's here." And as she looked at Marcus, she saw the determination in his eyes, mirroring her own. They weren't done. Not yet. The courtroom was packed. Rows of spectators filled every seat, their eyes locked on the front where Gloria sat, calm but unyielding. Cameras lined the back, capturing every detail as the case that had shaken the city reached its conclusion. The air was heavy with tension, but Gloria remained still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady. Marcus sat beside her, his foot tapping lightly against the floor. He glanced at her every few seconds, as if looking for reassurance, but Gloria didn't need to speak. Her presence said everything. Across the aisle, Bradley sat hunched over, his shoulders slumped and his face pale. The cocky smirk he once wore was gone, replaced by the hollow look of someone who had finally run out of excuses. His lawyer whispered something to him, but Bradley barely responded. He looked smaller now, like a man who had been stripped of everything that once made him feel powerful. Behind him, several officers sat together, their uniforms crisp but their expressions tense. They had come to show support, but there was no hiding the unease in their eyes. Reed sat further back, alone. He didn't wear his uniform. He didn't belong with the others anymore. His head was down, but every now and then, he would glance toward Gloria, a flicker of guilt and determination passing over his face. He had testified, laid everything bare, and now all he could do was wait, hoping it was enough to make amends. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Gloria straightened in her seat, her heartbeat steady as the proceedings began. The evidence had been overwhelming, documents, testimonies, videos that left no room for denial. Bradley's defense had crumbled under the weight of the truth, and now the final verdict hung in the air. When the judge finally spoke, the words felt heavier than any Gloria had heard before. Bradley was found guilty on multiple charges: misconduct, abuse of power, falsifying reports. He was sentenced to prison and stripped of his badge permanently. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, but Gloria didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She simply exhaled, a long, quiet breath that carried months of tension away. As Bradley was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, he looked back once. His eyes locked with Gloria's, but she didn't flinch. There was no hatred in her gaze, no triumph, only certainty. Bradley turned away, his head down, and disappeared through the doors. Outside, reporters swarmed. Microphones and cameras pointed at Gloria as questions fired from every direction. Marcus stepped in front of her instinctively, but Gloria gently pushed him aside and stepped forward. Her voice carried above the noise, calm and clear. "This isn't just about me," she said. "This is about every person who's been silenced, every person who's been treated like they don't matter. Today isn't the end, it's the beginning. Accountability is only the first step. Real change comes when we stop looking away and start demanding better." The crowd erupted with more questions, but Gloria turned and walked away, her focus already shifting to what came next. Marcus followed closely, his energy still high but tempered by relief. Over the next few months, the fallout continued. Monroe resigned under mounting pressure, and several other officers faced investigations of their own. Policies were reviewed, reforms were proposed, and the community rallied to push for lasting change. Gloria became a voice for that change, not because she sought attention but because people listened when she spoke. Reed kept his distance at first, unsure if he had a place in this new world he had helped expose. But Gloria didn't shut him out. She saw the guilt he carried and gave him the space to prove himself. He worked behind the scenes, using his knowledge of the system to help dismantle what was broken and rebuild something stronger. Marcus threw himself into the fight alongside her, his anger transformed into purpose. He helped organize protests, worked with advocacy groups, and made sure Gloria's voice reached further than ever. For the first time, he saw what real change looked like, not quick or easy, but steady and unrelenting. And Gloria never stopped. She spoke at schools, town halls, and rallies. She sat in meetings with lawmakers and pushed for policies that protected those most vulnerable. Her story wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. But through it all, she remained grounded. She still did her own shopping, still walked through her neighborhood, and still carried herself with the quiet strength that had always defined her. The world saw her as a symbol, but she never stopped being Gloria Harris, a woman who had fought wars abroad and at home and won both. Now, as she stood in front of a crowd at a community center, she looked out at the faces watching her, some filled with hope, others with uncertainty. She spoke not to inspire but to challenge. "It's not enough to be outraged," she said. "It's not enough to share a post or march for a day. Real change happens when we stay uncomfortable, when we refuse to let things go back to the way they were. It happens when we hold each other accountable, not just in moments like this but every day. The question isn't what you're willing to fight for, it's whether you're willing to keep fighting when it gets hard, when no one's watching, when it feels like nothing's changing. That's when it matters most." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling in. Gloria let it hang for a moment before stepping back. Marcus joined her, pride written all over his face, and together they walked off the stage. This story reminds us how fragile justice can be and how much work it takes to protect it. It's easy to look away, to convince ourselves that someone else will step in, but real change requires all of us to stand up, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's risky. What would you do if it were you? Would you speak out? Would you fight for what's right? We want to hear your thoughts. Share your comments below and let us know how this story made you feel. And if you believe in standing up for justice, make sure to subscribe to the channel Tales of Twist and hit the like button to support more stories like this one. Thank you for watching.